Time. Where does it come from? Where does it go? How is a man in a police box able to travel through it? Regardless, for us mere humans, it's always moving forward. Unless you know something that I don't know. Seriously, you would tell me if you knew how to time travel, right? In today's video, we're going to be talking about manipulating time in our videos by using something called a time lapse. I'm going to talk briefly about what a time lapse is, I'm going to talk about why you might want to do it, and then I'm going to go through 3 different ways that you can do it and the pros and cons of each method. But before we get into it, head down to the comment section and let me know what you use time lapses for. And on your way down there, hit that like button to let me know you're paying attention. Okay. What in the name of Casey Neistat is a time lapse? A time lapse is a video that's sped up faster than real time to show the passing of time. Remember all those boring classes you took in high school? A time lapse is what you wish you could have done in real life to make them go faster. It's basically putting life on fast forward. But why would you want to use a time lapse in your videos? Generally, I think there are 3 main reasons. The first reason, as I mentioned before, is to show the passing of time. If in your video you have a scene that's ending and the next shot doesn't pick up for a couple hours later in the day, you can show your audience that time has passed by showing like 5 seconds of a time lapse in between those 2 shots. Even though your audience is only watching 5 seconds worth of video, they subconsciously know that a lot more time has passed because of how sped up that time was. The second reason that you might want to use a time lapse is just for a visually interesting shot. If you need some interesting B-roll, something to catch the viewer's attention, you can use a time lapse and it can be very helpful. After watching a bunch of clips that were all in real time, seeing something that's sped up by 10,000% will definitely be more interesting to them. And the third reason you might want to use a time lapse is just for a specific vibe. Now, this isn't a hard rule or anything, but generally, time lapses aren't super relaxing to watch. Some of them can be, but often when you're watching something super sped up like that, it's kind of more jarring than it is relaxing. But if you're looking for something with kind of a frantic vibe to it, pair a time lapse with some speedy music and you're off to the races. Okay, so now we know what they are, and we know why we might want to do them, but that doesn't do us much good if we don't know how to do a time lapse. Like I said before, I'm going to go over 3 different ways to do it and the pros and cons of each method. I use all of these in different situations, it just depends on what I need. That being said, a little disclaimer, the second method is actually a little bit specific to the type of camera that you have. The way that I'm going to show you how to do it is specific to Sony cameras, but I know there are a lot of other cameras and even phones out there that can also do it this way. So as long as you're familiar with the functions of your camera, you might be able to make this work as well. Okay, in order to show you the first method of how to shoot a time lapse, we're actually going to try our hand at some time travel here and go back to when I was setting up to shoot this video. What is up, people from the future? Dunna from the past here. I'm just about to set up to shoot the video talking about 3 different ways to do a time lapse, and I thought that this might be the perfect way to show you guys the first of 3, mostly because we're already doing it. Basically, the first way that you can do it is you just roll video and speed it up in post. The obvious advantage to doing it this way is that it's easy. You're already rolling video, all you do is just keep rolling it. Now that being said, I would suggest a couple of things. First of all, lock off your focus into manual focus mode. So for this example, I'm going to lock off focus to the vanishing cabinet back there where I'm going to be doing most of the work setting up my set to shoot. The reason you want to lock off focus is so that when things are moving around in the frame, it's not constantly hunting for focus, because when you speed that up, it's going to look quite jarring. We want it to stay focused in the same area so that it looks nice and smooth. The pros for using this method are the fact that it's super easy to do if you're already set up and shooting video. All you do is let it run and then just speed it up later. Depending on what software you use, it's usually as easy as 2 or 3 clicks and you've got the whole thing sped up. This method is also really handy because you have the ability to go back to real time. So if something happens that you want to show in real time, you just slow the clip back down and you're good to go. So for example, I just walked back up to the camera, took my manual focus off so that it would autofocus on my face, and I can start talking to you without ever cutting the clip. And then when I'm ready, I can get out of the frame, turn my manual focus back on and go back into it. And the third thing that's really handy about this method is you can also record audio at the same time. You can separate your audio and your video and just use that audio still. Okay, so I've got most of my setup ready to go, but I'm gonna need to borrow my camera. So let's hop back into the future and we'll talk about this way a little bit more. Now, some of the downsides to this method are the fact that you're kind of limited in how much motion blur you can do. Personally, I like time lapses that have a lot of motion blur to show that things are moving really fast. And when you speed it up this way, it doesn't really give you that look. Another downside is that you're not getting the best quality of the three. It's not bad. If you're shooting in 4K, you're still getting the same quality that you were when you were shooting video anyway, but method number 3 is going to give us the best quality for sure. Another downside are the file sizes to this method. If you want to shoot a half hour of video and compress it down to 5 seconds, you literally have to shoot a half hour of video. That can leave you with huge file sizes. And while we're speaking of computers, it's also going to be really hard on your computer. I know every time I pull one of these big video files into Premiere Pro and try and speed it up by a whole bunch, it really taxes the computer. And the final downside is just that you're limited by your camera's record time limit. Some of the newer hybrid cameras are starting to get rid of the time limit, but a lot of them still have that 30-minute record limit on them. So if you wanted to do a time lapse that spanned over 30 minutes, you might not be able to do that unless you're really quick on making sure you're right there to start it recording again when it hits that first time limit. Okay, on to the second method of getting a time lapse. Like I said before, this is the one that's a little bit specific to whatever camera you might have. In the Sony cameras, this is called S&Q. So what you're gonna have to do is turn your camera into S&Q mode and then go into the S&Q settings. Now, here, it gives you some options. You can record at up to 120 frames per second and it will play back down to 24 frames per second. So you can do slow motion right inside your camera, or you can go the other way, and that's what we're gonna do. You can go down to shooting 1 frame per second and it'll play back as fast as 30 frames per second. Now, in my case, typically I choose 1 frame per second and speed it up to 24 frames per second. So again, another pro for this method is that it's relatively easy to set up. Basically, you switch into that mode, you hit record, and you're good. The best part about this method is that it's super convenient. All of the time lapsing, all of that speeding up, it does it right in camera. So you can watch back your time lapse immediately after you're done. And with this method, you can actually play with your motion blur a little bit better. Because we know we're not going to be able to go into real time in this method, we can play with our shutter speed to make sure that the motion blur is there. If you're doing humans moving around, something like 1/5 of a second or 1/10 of a second should give you the desired effect. And the final advantage for this is that it's super easy on the computer. When you put it into your editing software, it's just another video file. The video editing software doesn't know that it's a time lapse, it just sees the frames and it plays them back. Now, as for the limitations of this method, specifically with Sony, it'll only go up to 1080. So we've lost the ability to do 4K in this, which is kind of a bummer. But if you're shooting in 1080 anyway, this is okay. Again, every camera might have different options as far as this goes. Maybe your camera doesn't limit you to a smaller resolution. Another limitation specifically in the Sony cameras is that you can only go as slow as 1 frame per second. So if you're trying to do something like the clouds moving where you want to use like a 3 second or a 5 second per shot, you really can't do that with this method. Maybe if your clouds are moving really fast, it'll look good though. Another downside to this one is that we've got no audio. We're just recording video in this case, and we also don't get the option to go back into real time like we did with the first method. Basically, use this when you for sure want a time lapse, you want better motion blur than in the first method, and you don't want the headache of having to put together a time lapse later in your computer. By the time that you import that footage into your computer, it's already a time lapse. You're good to go. I guess too, if you want to send this straight to your phone to post, this is the best way to do it. Okay, moving on to the third and final. This is the classic way to do a time lapse. This method includes using your camera's built-in intervalometer or an external intervalometer to take photos and then stitch them together later. This is the method that you want to use if you want to have the highest quality possible for your time lapse. That's really the biggest advantage to this method. On a lot of cameras nowadays, you're shooting in 24 megapixels, which is basically a 6K okay video file when all is said and done. You can use that to crop in and reframe or add movement. Another advantage is you also have the ability to shoot in either RAW or JPEG. RAW giving you incredible flexibility as far as editing and post. JPEG still probably better than shooting video. And the final advantage of this is that it gives you the most flexibility as far as how the time lapse actually looks in the end. So when we were talking about motion blur and all that kind of stuff before, this is the one that's going to give you the most flexibility. We can add lots of motion blur. We can do shots that are 5-10 seconds apart. You can span over an entire night to do like night sky time lapses. You can set your intervalometer to whatever you want. So this is really the most flexible as far as getting time lapses, if you know you want a time lapse out of that shot. If your camera has an intervalometer or an interval shooting function built into it, you're going to want to go into that and you're going to want to choose how often you want it to shoot. This is something that you'll have to play around with a lot. For things like the clouds moving in the sky, I like to do either a 3-second or a 5-second shutter. And then for things like people moving, I like to do a 1-second shutter. But it also depends on how much time you want to then compress into your time lapse. I'll leave a link in the description to a calculator so that you can find out what kind of settings you might want to get the results that you want. But I do suggest that you play with this a lot and just kind of have some fun with it. You'll get used to the settings that you like. If your camera doesn't have an intervalometer built into it, you can buy a separate intervalometer that will tell your camera when to shoot. I did a video on the Syrup Genie Mini 2, which is a motion controller, but it's got the intervalometer built into it as well. And so I let that be my intervalometer and tell my camera when to shoot. If you're shooting in RAW to get the most flexibility for editing, you're then gonna have to pull all your photos into your photo editor of choice, edit them there, apply, in my opinion, probably the same edit to all of your photos to make sure that it's consistent, or use an app like LR Time-Lapse that'll allow you to gradually change things throughout the time lapse if you need to. Then you have to export all of those RAW files into JPEG files, then import those JPEG files into your video editor as a sequence, and then, and only then, will it be a video file that's sped up to the way that you want it to be. And that's where the first con of this method comes. It is the most time-consuming of the three methods. Also, if you're shooting in RAW, you're gonna have some huge file sizes. Get ready to have a giant folder full of these RAW images. Again, like the second method, we've got no audio to go with this, so if you want audio, you're gonna have to record that separately. And for the most part, there's no immediate playback if you shoot it this way. Now, I know that there is a bit of a workaround for this on the Sony cameras if you're shooting specifically using their interval timer that's built in on the newer cameras. But for the most part, if you're shooting with an interval timer on most cameras, there's no way to preview your time lapse. So again, you want to use this if you want the most control, if you want the highest quality possible, and if you want to shoot over very long times. Okay. That's 3 methods that you can use to shoot time lapses for your videos. But as always, I want to hear from you. So make sure to head down to the comment section below and leave me a comment letting me know which of the 3 methods is your favorite, or maybe I missed one. Maybe you've got another idea that you can use to shoot time lapses. Let me know down there, and on your way down, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Make sure to hit the bell notification so you don't miss any of my future videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.